want to tell you what I've been doing the last couple years. I've been working on the early Cretaceous of Utah and the Jurassic, for a long time. But the early Cretaceous, I've got a good 30 years in on it now, from the point we didn't know much of anything until now, where we really are starting to open up the big questions that it has the data to be resolved. Sadly, I'm too old to resolve it. So there's going to be a new generation of people coming out here working on this, but I'm trying to throw out some big questions that I think we have the data to approach and get people to work on it. But this is Utahraptor Ridge. That's the official place name for that big escarpment there. And you can see where we got the Utahraptor megablock up there. We carried, a couple tons of plaster and water up there on our backs, and we've finally got a track hoe to drag it off, but we had a jacket up there, ready to go before we could drive a track hoe up there to bring the last beams up to build the box we put it in. The Morrison Formation has these incipient carbonate rich paleo-soils, and these soils you get in the Morrison, in the upper part of the Morrison, are really pretty poorly developed because deposition rates are very low. In fact, that whole exposure to the top of those little hills probably is less than 2 million years of time. So the deposition rate's really, really high. So you don't develop mature types of paleo-soils. And we are missing the last stage of the Jurassic. That's the gap that we have to deal with. In general, when you look at the Morrison is an incredibly rich fauna. We know of over 100 different taxa when you start including things like the frogs and the salamanders and the lizards and the mammals and things that also occur within these rocks. It's a diverse and really well-studied ecosystem, but it is a total ecosystem. But we're going to look at the dinosaurs because they're, for a lot of the rocks I'm working on, that's the main fossils we find that we actually have robust enough data to talk about. Now, if we look at the Morrison Formation, as I said, we're missing about the last 5 million years of the Jurassic. So we're really missing this last stage, the Tithonian. But we have an incredible record of the Kimmeridgian, and the base of the Morrison dinosaur levels is Oxfordian, because we have good radiometric dates to show that. So, but we don't have a lot of dinosaurs in the Oxfordian stuff yet. But they're working on it. And Wyoming, when we look at the kinds of dinosaurs, it's logical to think, as you go up following the Seaway, the Sundance Sea retreating into Canada, you would think that as you go into Wyoming, you get younger and younger rocks because the Seaway shorelines are progressing into Canada. Well, that's not the pattern we see when we look faunally at it. And I'm a biostratigrapher, so I kind of like the animals. We find that the brushy basin fauna, which is characterized by things like Allosaurus fragilis and Stegosaurus itself, are only at the very top. In the lower part of the assemblage, the stegosaur called Hesperosaurus and Allosaurus jim madsoni, which are in the plateau or in the saltwash member, the lower part, they go pretty high in the Morrison up north. And we don't see anything above this pretty thin fragilis fauna. But if we go around the Denver Basin, there's some different things. But one of the things we see there is we have some different taxa that are big and don't occur elsewhere in the interior. And large among this is like Camarasaurus grandis, the biggest, and everyone admits the last species in the genus Camarasaurus, and by far the biggest taxa. In the Garden Park area, thing Cope named Epanterius, giant allosaurid. And if you go to Cimarron County, Oklahoma, what they called Saurophaganax, and now it's being called Allosaurus anax, but still, a huge Allosaurus, bigger than fragilis, monstrous size animals. And Cope's rules, one of the things we've learned in paleontology is, given everything being equal, animals tend to get bigger through time. And this is by far the largest of the faunas. Even though we're missing that last 5 million years, I've had the good fortune to get to work in Spain and Portugal. And Spain and Portugal have faunas of Tithonian age. And when you look at it, it is so similar to the Morrison. I mean, they have Camarasaurs. Laryngosaurus is a Camarasaur. It's a real big one, and it's not Camarasaurus. No one, everyone thinks, but no one has a question that it's not a Camarasaurid. Very close to Camarasaurus, but big. I looked at that thing a few months ago, and it really is gigantic. The type material in Lisbon. But no one questions we've got a lot of these animals. Lusotitan is a big brachiosaurus. You know, if you watched the new Walking with Dinosaurs, they have a whole chapter on Lusotitan. You know, it's a big brachiosaur, and it's very close to Brachiosaurus, but it is a bit different. And I'll bring its name up here again in a bit. But there we got Stegosaurus itself, and we've got a thing called Marangaya, which they now think also occurs in the Morrison in Wyoming. So basically it's a Morrison-style dinosaur fauna. And the top of those sea cliffs, you see, we have the Cretaceous Jurassic boundary marked with some little marine tongues that come in with the last of the Jurassic dinosaurs, and they're Berriasian, basal Cretaceous. So the boundary is well dated, and there's some other things, pollen, whatnot, that they've thrown at this stuff. So they're really comfortable with the age. But we look at this stuff and we know we have a Morrison fauna. And that means when you look at it going from the late Oxfordian through the Kimmeridgian Tithonian, Morrison-style fauna is dominated by these big long-necked dinosaurs, a diversity of big meat-eating dinosaurs. That fauna went for about 12 million years. But as I said, there's, older levels, there's that Oxfordian stuff, maybe we don't know enough about it, but we have certainly at least two well laid out zones now of dinosaurs in the Morrison, maybe a third one with Cimarron County. So there is evolution and maybe minor extinctions through this time interval. Once again, more work to do. But a Morrison-style fauna exists in Europe and North America for a good 12 million years. If we look at the new work, Phil Mannion's summary, basically, the Morrison fauna's got a good diversity. And look at that big question mark, the gap there at the base of the Cretaceous. The French have a couple things. They've got a little fauna in France dominated by ornithomimids. They have what they think is Camarasaur and maybe a Turriosaur, but you see the question mark. Biggest problem we have almost everywhere is we just don't have a good record of the basal Cretaceous. But if we come to Utah, we really do have an incredible record. And we've only known this for the past 30 years. And actually only in the last few years have we really, sunk home, what we've got. So you look at that chart for the early Cretaceous, top of the Morrison. That's what we knew in 1993. There were 22 dinosaurs in Utah that had names on them. There were a couple in the North Horn, most were in the Morrison, and there were 3 that had been named from the Cedar Mountain Formation. And one of those turns out to actually be in the Morrison Formation, so that doesn't count. So there are only 2 in the Morrison Formation, the Cedar Mountain Formation. And as we've worked, you can see what we've filled out. And there's more to fill out. I think there's more faunal horizons. I said there's Yellow Cat's got 4 or 5 faunas, I'm sure of it now. It's a pretty remarkable record. But when we look at, the chemostratigraphy, here's that Weissert. They've got that really nailed in with radiometric dates and good chemostrat records through here. And we've done a lot through the Aptian Albion as well and have documented those global anoxic events. Because what happens, the ocean would periodically get stagnant and fetid, and a whole bunch of organic carbon was buried on the sea floor. And plants and things take up lighter isotopes of carbon, carbon-12, and the heavier carbon-13 is preferentially not taken up. It's like you're picking up things. The lightest one, I'll take 3 of those, and maybe just one of those heavy ones. And that's pretty much how it works, how they fit into the lattices and whatnot. So we end up enriching seawater in the atmosphere in carbon-13 versus 12, because the 12 is being buried. So we see this pattern. These are global records. Things that we're looking at the world's atmosphere and how carbon changes the isotopic ratios and its burial at those anoxic events. And that's where a lot of the world's oil comes from, is organic carbon buried during those events. But we have a real good framework. And if we look at the dinosaurs, it's nuts what we've learned. We're just starting to digest this. And people go, who cares if you name a new dinosaur? You're just sorting marbles. But as I like to tell people, when you got enough marbles, you can start doing stuff with them. You can make packets. You can start playing Chinese checkers. You can build pyramids and walls. You can do stuff with a bunch of marbles. And from 2 marbles in the early Cretaceous of Utah, we've gone up, we're counting the stuff that's still not named, more than 50 dinosaur taxa for sure. Now, Brigham Young University right now has at least 15 they haven't even named yet in their collections. It drives me nuts, but they're there. But here's Utah Raptor Ridge again, this incredible record. We have dates, we have fossils, and in the lower part, we've got a paleo-soil story. We split this yellow cat, this lower unit of the Cedar Mountain, into 2 packages. A lower yellow cat member that's really stacked fossil soil horizons with bone beds, and an upper yellow cat. And the upper yellow cat's where we get Utah Raptor. But that's only in the Paradox Basin. It's not elsewhere. The yellow cat, the lower yellow cat, occurs all the way from Dinosaur National Monument all the way down to Bears Ears now. And it correlates, it's below the Barrow Canyon and Blanding Basin, and it interfingers laterally into the Buckhorn River system. So keep that in mind. Now, why is this different than we used to think? Is if you go from Mexico all the way up into Canada along the Rocky Mountain Escarpment, we look at the history of mountain building. Basically, there's a period of quiescence. And there's this orogeny that people don't talk about much. It's important in this part of the world and in Nevada, but the Elko orogeny. Basically, the Elko is really a middle Jurassic orogenic interval. And as you go toward the mountains, this is mountains were building up in Nevada. And as these mountains were building up, the crust around them subsides. As you build up weight on it, it's what we call isostatic loading, pushes the surrounding countryside down, creates a basin adjoining these mountains. And we see that if we look at the Carmel, look at the Navajo, all this stuff thickens as you go into Nevada. But the thing, people used to think the Morrison did that, the Upper Jurassic. And, and that was tied to the next orogeny, the severe orogeny, and that just one went into the other. It basically was always orogeny, it's always mountain building going on. But it's been turned out as we've dated the rocks in central and western Utah, those rocks are not Upper Jurassic. All the dates that we've got show that they're equivalent to the Upper Cedar Mountain. They're Aptian and Albian. So they have nothing to do with the Morrison Formation. But you look in old literature, there's papers published last year that talk about the Morrison-Foreland Basin. There is no such thing. The Morrison pinches out as you go down I-70 before you hit Salina, where we actually used to think we had the last sliver of Morrison. That turns out to be even Cretaceous. And then it really thickens in all these conglomerates and stuff that are well dated now as Cretaceous in age. So it's like the Morrison pinches out to the west. And what I think is going on between these mountain building episodes is we have an interval of quiescence. The mountains are still eroding, and they're still up there. But as they erode, you put less weight on the landscape. So as you erode the mountains, all of a sudden the landscape starts to rise. And you have isostatic rebound. And the sediments are worked laterally out into the basin. You tend to get conglomerate sheets and big coarse-grained units going way out in the basin where during the peak of mountain building, the big coarse boulder conglomerates like the Echo Canyon conglomerate, you go into Salt Lake, you drive through that stuff is gone within miles of the mountain escarpment. So you look at those mountains, those conglomerates, thousands of feet of boulder conglomerate. And you go to Price, Utah, Price River Canyon, and there's not a pebble in that stuff. And even with one thrust that causes those narrow conglomerate, it basically doesn't account for 50 miles. It's not that much distance. So what happens is those mountains dump their load, like you see in Death Valley, the big alluvial fans coming down, right at the toe of the mountains. And then the ocean comes right up to it. That's the pattern we see in the Upper Cretaceous. So keep that in mind. And the reason we have the gap is this period of quiescence. You're not dumping sediment out like you were during these mountain building episodes, and there's a gap between them. So we've always had a 20 to 25 million year gap everywhere. Why do we in eastern Utah have a record that exists nowhere else in North America? Well, that has to go back into the Paleozoic to see the roots for why this is going on. Is during the late Paleozoic in the Carboniferous or Pennsylvanian, there was a large southern hemisphere ice age going on. And, as you probably know, when you build big ice caps, sea level falls. You melt your ice caps, sea level rises. And during this ice age in the southern hemisphere, sea level was rising and falling quite a bit. Well, in the late Paleozoic, in Colorado and eastern Utah, we had the ancestral Rockies come up, these big fault block mountains. And we developed this big basin to the west of the Uncompahgre ancestral mountains. And that basin we call the Paradox Basin. And the sea from the Pacific would flood in when sea levels were high, fill it with water, and you find brachiopods and shark teeth and things. And then when you have a glaciation episode in the southern hemisphere, it would dry up, and then you get salt. So you get salt, shale, till we get 3,000 feet of salt in the Paradox Basin running along the Uncompahgre, at the level of Moab. And that's where we get all our potash down there, and this whole Paradox Basin system is formed. And it's because of salt that we have this unique record. Because salt never turns into rock. Salt always stays plastic. It's just its properties are such that when you get a bunch of salt and you squeeze it, it moves. It flexes. It's very fluid for a solid thing. And that's not just halite salt, sodium chloride, but it's also sulfates as well, salts in general. Don't get hard. So what happens is, as we've covered this region with sediment in the latest Paleozoic, the Cutler, the big fans coming out of the ancestral Rockies, and some marine tongues, and then the Triassic packages of the Chinle Formation, Moenkopi. The weight of all those rocks squeezed down in those salt beds, and the salt would find a fault or a weakness in the rock, it would squirt up. And some of this are associated with faults for sure. Moab fault has got a salt anticline under it. There's no question in seismic data. And what happens is you make, in this part of the world, instead of domes, we build up big salt walls. These big northwest to southeast trending uplifts of salt that came up. And in places like Professor Valley, drive up along the Colorado River, the salt came up and it was exposed on the surface as, salt glaciers. So it was actually flowing on the surface. We see this today in Iran. Modern salt deposits being squirted up out of the ground. And that was happening in the Permian and Triassic in Professor Valley. And you can just go out and see the outcrops when this is occurring. But people have always said that stopped happening at the end of the Triassic. We can prove, and everybody that's worked with me on this over the years agrees, it was going on through the entire geologic record. You squeeze it, it's still going to squirt. And during the early Cretaceous, the evidence is that the salt shifted south along the structural axis of all those salt folds, and went to the southeast. And as it did that, we have subsidence in the northern Paradox Basin around High 70 and Moab, in that region, that doesn't occur really to the south as much. But now we have the lower Yellow Cat and Blanding Basin, so we may have to change our tune a little bit. And we're only missing the upper Yellow Cat. Um, if you follow the highway going across, because of this real unique, record of rocks going across this east to west, we're going to be concerned with on this is the yellow cat unit south of I-70, because that is an incredibly fossiliferous record of the basal Cretaceous. And that's the unit below the key here with the bright blue upper yellow cat drawn in there that only occurs in the Northern Paradox Basin. And if you look at that record we've got there, it is really unique. And that's salt tectonics. It occurs nowhere else in North America. All of these dinosaur faunas are unique there. And for most of the stuff through this whole interval that we box off here, these are unique in North America. None of this stuff is known anywhere else in North America, spanning 45 million years of early Cretaceous time. This is just along the Yellow Cat Road. I've got a paper in review right now naming another dinosaur from here. But they have 10 genoholotype dinosaurs within 2.5 miles of the Yellow Cat Road on either side. But look at the scale, 1 mile. That's a little area. There's more new dinosaurs there than Dinosaur National Monument. There's nothing like this except for Dinosaur Provincial Park and Liaoning, China. And that's just this one unit. And the Muscle Touch, it's just as good, over 100 taxa. We're not going to talk about that. Those are our major bone beds. All those little dots, all those little names written across there. Can't get in close enough. Just tell you, it's ridiculous how much is there. We don't go out and look, because we look, we're going to find a site we can spend our career working. It really is. It's incredible riches, and it's totally new to science. We didn't know any of this stuff existed. Just, shoot the image there, get that URL, and order Krista's book on the Cedar Mountain Formation that I talked her into doing. Because it is a good book, and someone's going to get it from the auction there. I don't know who got it, but it is a good book. I'm real happy I talked her into writing it, because I'm too busy doing this, describing new dinosaurs. That's some of the lower Jurassic, lower yellow cat stuff, the Berriasian age. 145, 142, maybe up to 138 megaannum. It's a basal stage of the Cretaceous. And we have multiple ankylosaur taxa. We have a giant. We have species B, which I'm naming right now. It's getting reviewed. We've got one kind of sauropod so far, Mirosaurus. It's Turiosaur. Those were before this were only known in Europe, which they're a major part of the Jurassic faunas of Europe. And it comes in and replaces sauropods. We begin to replace the total extinction of the Morrison sauropod assemblage. So that's a big deal with Mirosaurus. And it was for a while, it was the most complete Cretaceous sauropod known in North America for an individual. But iguanodonts, a variety, 4 kinds of, or at this level, 3 kinds of Therizinosaur. There's a 4th in the upper yellow cat. But you look at this fauna, it's nuts. We got a giant meat eater, teeth big across as my hand, and we just found a toe bone in one of these things. And, I thought it was a limb bone when I did. It's a toe bone of a big theropod. This is what our Doling's Bowl bone bed seems to have been. It seems to be a fern marsh. The Mirosaurus was stuck in the mud. So the hind legs fully articulated going down into the mud, an articulated foreleg going down into the mud. The upper part's kind of scattered around, but all in one big patch. We got Yorgavuchia, which is a little dromaeosaur, might be the ancestor of Utahraptor. It certainly seems similar in what we're getting. We're finding more parts of it. I don't think we have Therizinosaur. You can see the big carnosaur in the background. At least 2 kinds of iguanodonts, both known by complete growth histories from little ones up to big ones. Karen Poole is working on those. Of course, our ankylosaurs that those crocs are ripping apart. But it's a neat, very fossiliferous pond. We even got fish now in there, little bitty fish bones. They're like molly-sized fishes, but there are fish that are in among the fern roots in there, and at least 2 kinds of turtle, as well as crocodilians and of a number of kinds. The upper yellow cat, I think, is probably one fauna, but we have lots of bone beds of this site, including the Dalton Wells bone bed at Utahraptor State Park, which is a pretty massive bone bed. But we've got a bunch of bone beds of this animal. We got turtles and lungfish and 3D fishes, sections we just found laying on the ground. We've got Moabosaurus, a relative of Mirasaurus, a little more derived. And we got a Brachiosaurus, Cedarosaurus, which is a big brachiosaur. Brachiosaurus was for a long time one of the biggest dinosaurs known in the world. And if you look at that animal, I wish I had a person laying there for scale next to it. That's a big animal as well. And of course, my favorite dinosaur on the planet, Gastonia burgei, the crown prince of dinosaurs. You got ornithomimids, all kinds of stuff. Gaston Quarry is in the Upper Yellow Cat on the side of Lake Madsen, but we were probably during a period of drought. We've got sauropod trackways in the site. Of course, Utah raptor, at least 6 polycanthines. Within a few miles, we got other bone beds with more of the fauna laid out. But that's Valanginian age, so it's about 5 million years after the Dolling's Bowl site. These faunas compare best with faunas from Northern Europe, of what we call the Wealden Formation, Wealden group. And they're best formed in the Wessex of the Isle of Wight. You've got the upper part of this forming sea cliffs. And this fauna includes these polycanthine ankylosaurs, carcharodontosaurs. I didn't stress that the big meat eaters are definitely carcharodontosaurs. And they got pneumatic ribs and things that we see right from the beginning. None of them are allosaurids. So you got carcharodontosaurs. And it becomes an iguanodont, polycanthine-dominated fauna. And this goes all the way up to the end of the Birimian, maybe the very base of the Aptian. Where that boundary is fuzzy. Where there's another mass extinction we won't talk about this talk. But basically, we've got 22 to 23 million years when we have a Wealden fauna in North America and Europe. So you got 12 million years of one fauna, and then 22 to 23 million years of this other fauna. There's evolution, but the players stay the same, through this interval. So long intervals of just evolution, everything's going good, but no big change. So what happens? Big thing to keep in mind, there's no seaway. The Cretaceous, lower Cretaceous of Utah and the basal stuff, the seaway was in Canada and the Gulf Coast. You did nothing. But the Buckhorn River, which was originally described as a sheet of conglomerate coming out from the mountains, we now have gotten outcrops on both sides of it, and we've got the lower yellow cat paleo-soils interfingering into it. So we now can trace that river from down by Big Water, where we get it in Wauweep Creek, all the way across, cutting down into the mid-Jurassic there, but cutting all the way up through the east part of Dinosaur National Monument and into Wyoming, where it probably just becomes the prior conglomerate river system as you go into eastern Wyoming. But if you look at the Morrison dinosaur fauna, I threw in, no, I don't have my Marpelta in that picture. But you look at all the animals that went out. The only things that really survived, stegosaur, we still have not a fragment of a stegosaur on this stuff. They existed elsewhere. They survived up until the end of the early Cretaceous. But the bipedal plant eaters and small meat eaters. If we look at the sauropods, they got, as I said, got hit really hard. And this is a paper, came out in 2025. Phil Mannion, we were talking about this. He's going, yeah, it's a total decimation of sauropods. But if you look, diplodic, scenes, the diplodikids do survive in the southern hemisphere into the basal Cretaceous, both with dicraeosaurs and diplodikids. There's a couple diplodikids known in the very basal Cretaceous with Argentina and South Africa, but nothing in the northern hemisphere. And, this is not the KT boundary. This was not a big enough event to kill everything across the planet. But it's a big event, no doubt. A Morrison fauna is pretty beloved, and you can see it decimated. Basically, this amazing diversity of sauropods, gone. So what else went out? The big meat-eating dinosaurs, the giants. This incredible diversity of animals that were probably feeding on a lot of these sauropods, Without their food, they also went extinct. But if you look, and the armored dinosaurs, the two lines of ankylosaur, one, the Gargoylosaurus line went out in North America, seems to have survived in Europe, may have given rise to ankylosaurids. And Mimorapelta gives rise to polacanthines, the next beds up. But if you look at the bipedal plant eaters, we have dryosaurs, camptosaur relatives. I mean, they go through almost unscathed. It's really amazing at how little effect that this event had on these bipedal plant eaters. Because we do have good evidence that a bunch of these things have descendants. And we do have a feathered Maniraptoran dinosaur in the Morrison. And we see that group really does well once it hits the base of the Cretaceous. Tanniclargus probably also had feathers. But these small animals, I think the early tyrannosaurs like Stoxosaurus, I think they went extinct in North America and didn't come back until until Asia reunited to the western part of the U.S. At the base of the Upper Cretaceous. But I've got people that hate me saying that, but we don't have any fossils at all, not a one, until you hit the base of the Upper Cretaceous. Now we start looking at this pattern, we really have a solid record. And these fossil soils that I'm going to get into talking about now, these are incredibly consistent. And now that we've recognized them going across the base of the Blanding Basin between the Morrison and the Burrow Canyon Formation, I'm really wanting to raise yellowcat to a formation, but it hasn't been around as a member long enough. It's got to grow up more and make the break at the poison strip. But these paleo-soils, the lower yellowcat, the same pattern of soils happens. But at the Morrison contact, if we don't have a basal conglomerate, we've got kaolinite, porcelain clay, and potentially bauxite nodules. We now realize that that surface where it's not a river is deeply weathered by lots of rainwater. And I'm working with a woman at the geography department at the U who does paleo-soils. She was a co-author with Demko on the Morrison paleo-sol volume. And she's like, she's totally on board with this. Like, it was wet, Jim. That's really wet. We have no evidence of anything that wet even in the Chinle, and it's just the contact. So we got laterites, and Christine Peterson, the queen of the Morrison, she was out with me looking at this and said, yeah, Jim, I think you got laterites here on the contact, which is good. I'm not a soil person. But, you look at that framework we're putting together, and those soils are in the same order from the wettest at the base at the contact, still wet with the iron manganese glacials just above the base. Then we go into these silicified peats, so they would have been coal if it wasn't so alkaline. It would have been coal beds like you see in the late Cretaceous. And then we go back into carbonate salt beds. So this, I'm a paleontologist. I work on bones, I work on shells, I do a lot of stuff on biostratigraphy. I measure strat sections. Paleo-soils are a major challenge. It's a whole thing in its own. So I love this slide that Greg Ledwigson made for me. Paleo-soils for dummies. And there's the biggest thing to get in your head when you look at these. We know a lot about modern paleo-soils. That's where all our food comes from. Mapping what kind of soil you got, and it's totally tied to climate. You can just map climate zones, and certain soils appear in different climate conditions. They really are where, and we know modern soil distributions really well. And basically, the biggest pattern, there's dozens of soil types and subtypes. If it's wet, you get iron and aluminum concentrating. And the reason it concentrates is the other stuff with the rainwater and moisture going through the soil leaches out soluble materials and brings it down to the groundwater, off in the rivers and into the oceans. So when it's wet, you leave behind iron and manganese. And if it's really wet, you even leach them out and you end up with aluminum as the main thing. That's why you get bauxite only in soil environments that were super wet, generally on tropical islands. And it's one reason aluminum that's, has ore that you can extract this stuff from is pretty rare. And if it's dry, semi-arid, it doesn't have to be a hard desert, But where evaporation is the main thing you're seeing, you get salts in the soil. Out here, you're alkali. You know, if you look at soils here in the spring, all the white crust that comes up in your soil, your grass starts getting white from alkali salts. That's because evaporative wicking is occurring. So you get carbonate, salt nodules and things forming in the soils. That tells you it's semi-arid to desert, hard desert. You get this stuff. You get a lot more salts in it as well. So wet, dry, that's as far as I can go. And when we see our soils, the base, we see these lateritic soils that can have manganese, but maybe aluminum now, we're thinking. Then we get the iron-rich soils, and then we get these silicified peat beds that we now know we can map fern mats in them, the whole bit, that these were bogs and marshes. So if we go down to the Blanding Basin, start in the south, this is the new reference section for the Upper Morrison, the Brushy Basin. Remember that most of the type section of the Brushy Basin is landslide deposits, but there is 6 miles north, there's a brilliant road cut. It goes through the entire thing. You know, it's a major road, but we have this bed of pure kaolinite and quartz sand. And I had put it in the base of the Cedar Mountain. But as we've studied it, we now realize it's the top of the Jurassic, and this bright red stuff below it is laterite. And it's got a lot of kaolinite in it too. We're not 100% kaolinite. I mean, there are no other clays in some of these boundary beds. And then you go a little bit above it, where that green arrow is, and you get all this iron-rich nodules coming out of it. And then a little bit higher than that, we've got the Burrow Canyon Formation, which is the big, you know, that used to be the base of the Cretaceous. But now we put the base of the Cretaceous down below, and we're mapping the yellow cat across the Blanding Basin on our new geologic maps. Here is just as you south of Blanding, as you turn on 95, heading toward Fry Canyon, you have this cut along the road. You could park buses along this, but you can see the contact. You've got a little channel there, but it pinches out. Again, a lot of kaolinite in that thing. We've got right at the top in these bright red beds. You can see in this picture, or you can see them over here with these guys. We think those are bauxite, and they're doing some geochemical studies of those. Pretty interesting. And we've got this whole iron-rich zone, and we go up, and there's some other soils. And we've sampled some of these soils for detrital zircons to see if we can catch an ash or something in these paleo-soils, because they weren't formed overnight. So with any luck, and the zircons you get, they come down from volcanic ash, are indestructible. So it doesn't matter what the soils are doing, what animals are doing. Animals can eat them, they can poop them out. Those zircons just don't care, you know, whatever happens to them. So we can get dates, but we need to, you know, I wouldn't ever sample a sandstone again for detrital zircons. I only look at paleo-soils. That's where we're getting really good data, where you're catching ashes in some of them. That's been really exciting. This is going up to I-70. This is a road cut just on the west side of the San Rafael Swell. If you stop at the rest area and look up the hill, you'll see a big buckhorn conglomerate bench at the top of the Morrison. But you can see it over in that picture in the corner there. You know, that interfingers and pinches out before you hit the interstate where the road goes through it. And I don't know why no one has really paid attention to this, because you've got the kaolinite beds down here, big zone of these iron-rich paleo-soils going through it. And then you've even got layers of histosol, these little bacon agate silicified peat beds above that, before you hit what we call the cap rock, and you can trace that right over to the top of the buckhorn conglomerate, you know, as a marker bed. And sometimes even as stromatolites on it. That seems to be related to the unconformity on that surface. I mean, there's tons of work to do. I wish I could tell you I know everything, but I do not. Here's a couple sections in our main area we work around Yellow Cat, you know, the Ruby Ranch road section. You know, we go through that section there. You know, we got this thing that's the calcrete from hell, this monster bed that they used to use for the base of the Cedar Mountain. We now know it's way down section. This is where Christine Peterson started looking at this with me, because I had the pebble beds in the mud, and I was like, oh, this is the base of the Cedar Mountain. And Christine Peterson, who I respect a lot, she's just, Jim, I think this is kaolin, laterites. These are those soils that do get aluminum preserved in very wet soils. And then as we go up section, we get the iron just a bit above that. Then we get the big chert beds. And we see the same thing in our Dolings Bowl section. And our big bone bed is sitting on the highest of these cherts. And at the top there, we've got a bench, the calcrete bed above that. This is Don's Ridge near Green River. Utah Raptor Ridge as well over in that direction. And you look at the contact. This is uppermost Morrison here. And you've got these nodules in the paleosol kaolinite zones that are just intense manganese things. And as it turns out, they're mining manganese south of Green River during World War II. So the manganese is, was mined in this is mine work. That beam behind, in front of me there, that's from the mine working there. They were mining it here. And they mined it here, and they mined it at the Chinle, at the base of the Chinle on the Shinnerump unconformity with the Moenkopi. So the two big unconformities both have manganese mines associated with them, which I find really interesting. The two biggest unconformities in the Mesozoic of Utah. They both have the manganese beds. This is north of Dinosaur National Monument, Rainbow Park. And basically, Scott Madsen was the first one working up here. It's like, Jim, the base of the Cedar Mountains, all this orange and yellow stuff. And I go, oh, when I went up there, when we realized this was definitely the boundary down there, as we start getting gravels in it, and also realize there's all this iron, and that's the contact in this area. But we don't see calcretes, carbonates until up on that bench. And that was traditionally where they'd put the base of the Cedar Mountain in the around Dinosaur National Monument. But this is where the USGS UGS maps it in this region, the new 30 by 60 quads. It's on that surface. But if you look at the map showing the Buckhorn River, we have sites on either side of that river showing this stuff. They're not all, like on the east side. It's not like a big gravel sheet coming out from mountains. There were no mountains over there. There were hills that were being eroded down and were slowly rising from isostatic rebound. So we look at this. Here's a detail of the basal stuff across that same region for a paper I'm doing on the new ankylosaur. But basically, using these marker beds, tying them into some of our sites, we're able to get a much finer framework on the evolution of these armored dinosaurs. And they are evolving. Look at all those species. So these things aren't just random. Every one is a different species. No, they have a stratigraphic distribution in these rocks. It's really cool stuff. I wish I was a lot younger. Now I'm just like, oh yeah, now I think I know what I should be doing. And as I look at these things, how this is the smaller ones. There's another lineage of giants. But these things, when we go from the Jurassic up, one of the big take-home messages beyond them getting spinier is they get wider. And I think this, and with big lateral spines, I think they're getting basically so it's harder to flip them over. Because my Morpelta is basically round in body cross-section, and these guys are really getting wide with the pelvis. It's pretty impressive. But you take that data, and we can put it all into one section and see that all these things are stratigraphically discrete when we correlate them on these marker paleosoil horizons that represent different climates. Well, aren't they diachronous? Climate isn't diachronous over an area that size. If it's real wet, it's going to be wet over a big region. And the pattern is always the same. But you see the density of bone beds we're starting to get. And there's more to come. Once again, this is what we get, this incredible framework tied to these paleosoils. So what caused it? Well, for a thing that caused that climate change, because remember, this shows it got really wet at the end of the Jurassic in western US. We have a crater in northern South Africa, Merquegan crater, very well dated at the JK boundary. I mean, they've drilled into it and get half-meter chunks of this thing. but it only forms a crater ring that's like about 80 or 70, 80 kilometers across, so it's not that big, yeah, but it's, it's a reasonable smack in the face for Earth at the time, but it hit crystalline continental rocks. And I think crystalline continental rocks have a very different fingerprint on the ecosystems than something hitting a barrier reef like the end of the Cretaceous. And if you look at what happened at the Manicouagan crater up in Quebec, which is in the late Triassic, it does seem to correlate to a faunal change between the Adamantine and Rhovoltian faunas, but that is not the level of extinction we see at the end of the Jurassic. It's the kind of thing we see between the upper and lower yellowcat more, so it's a significant boundary. The faunal levels do change, and there's probably smaller things that do it. So I think, that's the kind of effect we should see from South Africa, if we just look at it, nothing else. However, there's another potential player in this thing, and that's the Shanxi Rise off of the coast of Japan. And the Shanxi Rise is also dated at the JK boundary. Basically, it's either the first or the second. I was reading papers that said it was the biggest shield volcano in the solar system. Now I get people going, no, it's only the second biggest, Jim. So, okay, Olympus Mons, but we're in that neighborhood. This is bigger than the States. It's almost as big across as the Japanese archipelago. The Tamu Massif is a monstrous thing. But it didn't break the top of the Pacific when it came up. But it's miles thick, this big, huge shield volcano. And they've done, seismic studies. My buddy Mark Leckie at UMass was on the ship that drilled it a bunch of times. And the first fossils they see are early Cretaceous, not basal, but early Cretaceous stuff, once that built itself high enough to be above the carbonate compensation depth. Because if you have high water pressure, carbonate dissolves in seawater. So, if it's real deep, you don't get carbonate on this deep ocean floor. But as this thing got high enough, then the plankton started preserving on the top of it. And that dates in, well down in the early Cretaceous. So they're pretty comfortable. This is like JK boundary stuff as well. But one of the things I like is when you look at the hotspot tracks relative to plate tectonics, the tracks are from the northwest to the southeast. And if you look at this, it's kind of a spray of one big massif, but smaller ones as well. It tracks more to the 90 degrees to the northeast. It's at right angles to the way oceanic crust is moving there. And if you look at oceanic, pictures, look at it bigger, you look at that on the far corner up there, shows a track of a multiple number of seamount chains. And they all have that same track. But Shanxi, this splatter, and it's not a huge long thing like they are, is pretty confined, but it does stretch more in order, considering plate tectonics, maybe a little closer to where it would have been along the spin axis of the Earth. And my view, like has been proposed for Ontong Java in Indonesia, the biggest basalt field of oceanic basalt there is, they think that might be an asteroid impact, some people throwing it out. And I think this could be an asteroid impact that's breaking up. And for all I know, that one in South Africa is part of the same thing, coming in. If you look at the line on Jupiter, these things coming in, and no one has documented an impact in oceanic crust. And there's plenty of young enough craters on continental crust that have been found that should blow through oceanic crust, how thin that stuff is. So if you took a big asteroid, not as big as Chelyabinsk, but not the end of the Cretaceous, not a planet killer, but you blew it through oceanic crust, it's only like 10 kilometers thick, and exposed the mantle over a large area, what would that do? And no one has modeled this. I mean, I've been talking to people in NASA, and they, no one has ever actually tried to figure out what would happen if we did that. It's like so obvious there should be an impact somewhere in oceanic crust. Somewhere on planet Earth, there should be an impact or two. I think this might be one of them. And, obviously I'm not going to figure this out. I'm in my 70s. This is a 20, 30-year project. But I think this is something to pursue. And when I was in Germany at this Cretaceous conference, and I presented this stuff there, and got good reception. They're pretty supportive in Europe about what I'm doing. They brought up this thing, voice. That means the Volgan isotopic carbon excursion. And it was found in the Volgan Basin area, and basically it is a big kick, and it goes way negative for a bit before, with this positive kick. It's a big thing, but it's really different than what we see relative like Weissert's going, positive, where this thing goes way negative with a positive kick in it. It seems really different. And I'm not sure, what that is. And, I find that real exciting because I look at the time interval. And the thing I see with Shankshi, that's not an iridium layer. That's something that took time. Changing those paleo-soils from very wet back to semi-arid didn't happen in a million years even. I think it's a couple million years. It's an interval of time with dramatic global climate change going on. And this extinction also occurs in China. The Chinese, like Mamenchosaurs, all this stuff, they go out. All of our stuff goes out too. And basically, it takes time. It's a different kind of extinction. But the pattern, we look at what you've got here, the Triassic, Jurassic, look at a lot of these patterns. Major climate, rapid fluctuations are a major part in major megafaunal turnovers. And to me, that's like the take-home message. This experiment's been run multiple times, and maybe we can start finding a pattern. So thank you very much. Basically, is the Cretaceous sandwiched by asteroid impacts? Just leave you with that. I wish I had made this as a handout to give you all copies of, because there's a lot in it. But we have an amazing record. We didn't know any of this stuff when I was just starting this job as State Paleontologist. So it's like what we've pulled together is, crazy. And, so much more to be done. We're just opening up saying, these are some questions we should chase. So I'm on my soapbox. In Germany, gave it at SVP in Cleveland, gave it at GSA. I'm just going everywhere giving this basic talk. And I'm not getting booed. SVP, I thought I'd be booed off the stage. And I got a good reception. Thank you. And you got something there, Jim. Oh, great. I'm glad. KT Boundary, boy, they booed those guys right off the stage. SVP was not a fan for a decade plus.